We are back with some quick headlines. Google adding a new tool to the fight against ISIS. The tech company unveiling something called Redirect, which they hope will help slow down online recruitment. They're using targeted ads to redirect people who search keywords related to joining ISIS, and instead of bringing them to content, it brings them to content that would deter them from joining, as opposed to getting information. And hackers hit public transit, and now all rides are free. The ticketing machines at San Francisco train stations are now out of order, and the SFMTA's system isn't reading payment cards. The rail service is keeping the fare gates open as they work to fix the problem. Like the welfare state there, lots of free rides today in San Francisco. Sandra, over to you.
All right, thanks, Pete. Well, in the hours following Fidel Castro's death, many in the media were praising the Cuban dictator.
Fidel Castro was considered, even to this day, the George Washington of his country among those who remain in Cuba. He was also a very divisive figure.
You see the medicine system they are very proud of. You see athletes, and think of how many Cuban athletes have enriched the sports in this country and around the world.
He was a romantic figure when he came into power, and when he knocked off a corrupt dictator, Batista, we American young high school kids and kids in those days rooted like mad for the guy.
Is this a fair reaction for a harsh dictator like Castro? Joining me now to weigh in is veteran Spanish language journalist and Mega TV host Elvira Salazar. Good of you to be here this morning. What did you make of what you just heard from those journalists?
Well, good morning. I think that anybody that acclaims or praises the Cuban Revolution or Fidel Castro the way I am hearing my colleagues doing it have never lived in Cuba for more than a week. Absolutely, that Cuba and the Castro brothers offered the Cubans good health, good social services, good education, and absolutely wonderful athletics.
So why do you think there is such a difference from the way, say, we just heard from Chris Matthews, Brian Williams, talking about this romantic version of Cuba? Your parents fled Cuba. Why is there such a difference in the way they see it and the way you and the people of Cuba see it?
Because we have lived it. Because we know in reality what really happened. And what happened is that the Castro brothers offered the Cuban people a very perverse social contract, which meant I'm going to give you health and education and athletics, but you have to give me in exchange your life, your minds, and your freedom. That's a very perverse social contract, and that's a very high price to pay in order to get health and education. Why don't we go to let's go to Costa Rica. That's a much better example, where they offered health and education, but they didn't take away any of the social liberties.
And so you say that you say Cubans would escape that social contract to which you referred. When they could, they did.
Oh my God, they have escaped it for 56 years. 20% of the Cuban population has fled. You still have rafters trying to defy the sharks to come to the Florida coast. You have people the Cuban people try to flee as much as they can, unfortunately, because it's a torment to live on the Cuban island. But that's what, unfortunately, many of my colleagues do not realize and they do not see.
Have you spoken with any of them in the wake of Fidel Castro's death? When you hear those responses, and it's not just your journalist colleagues that are saying things like this, it is world leaders, including President Barack Obama, who has put out reaction to his death that also sounds like a romantic version of Fidel Castro and Cuba.
Absolutely, and I have spoken with many of them, but unfortunately they do not want to, they only want to look at the merits, but they do not want to see the miseries. There are 56 years of suffering, and you have been watching and you have been interviewing many of the victims, but when you talk to the Cuban people, even the people that are still living on the island and the people that have fled, it's very clear to all of us that it was one of the cruelest and most evil revolutions that the America has ever seen. That if you're going to talk about the acclaim, you're going to talk about the good things, you also have to talk about the miseries. You have to say that Cuba right now has the highest suicide rate in the Americas per capita. You also have to say that right now, like I said, there are thousands of rafters or people trying to escape and they can't. You also have to say that homosexuals, gay and lesbians were put in concentration camps called the UMAPs to change their sexual preferences. You have to say that the Castro brothers shut down Catholic churches and Jewish synagogues and kicked out the rabbis and the priests. So there's a long list. It's true that they gave wonderful health and education and athletics, but you also have to say the cost they paid, and we're still paying the Cuban people. But now it's a new dawn.
And with
so let's put
Raul
all
in
that
power,
aside.
what do you see
It's
as the future
dawn
for Cuba?
And that is what we're betting on. And like I said, you know, we're talking about the miseries, but let's talk about the future and the positive. Right now, there's a new dawn, there's a new era that could open for Cuba. And it depends on Raul Castro and the military elite that surrounds him.
And
they should take up
based on what we just heard from your colleagues in the media, saying that he's the George Washington of his country among those remain in Cuba. Will you see any change in the media and the way they see Cuba and Raul running that country?
But, you know, George Washington was the founding father of the most extraordinary country in the world that is the beacon of human rights. Everybody wants to come to the United States because here you can live your American dream. So I don't think that there's any comparison. Is the opposite, George Washington and Fidel Castro. It's just that people buy the marketing. The Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro was an expert at the marketing, and they won the war of the ideas, but not the war that but not the reality that Cubans needed to live. But like I said, it's a new dawn. We're happy. I think it's a new era, and it depends on Raul whether he's going to take up what President Obama has offered him, which has been wonderful economic reforms. And
certainly good to get your thoughts and perspective on that this morning, Elvira Salazar. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.